Having a joint talk today by two graduate students here, and they're going to talk about a paper that recently published with the Atacama Cosmology Telescope. So Simran and Erika, please take it away.
Great, thank you. So yeah, we're going to first make an overview and a little bit of our news data release, and then we'll get into the methods and paper. Okay, so the Atacama Cosmology Telescope was the ground-based CMB telescope in the Atacama Desert of Chile. Operated from about 2007 to when we commissioned it in 2022. Oh, okay. You can see a picture of it here. It's quite down. It said the Simons Observatory built there. Importantly, we have about 5 times the angular resolution and about 3 times its sensitivity. The operation is composed of about 160 people across 60 institutions worldwide. Many of us are now involved themselves, continuing on this work, and this is from the last collaboration meeting in Princeton. Okay, so you saw the press release a couple weeks ago for year 6. These slides look familiar, but what I'm showing you is the CMB temperature factor against multiples, where a multiple is like an inverse angular scale, larger multiples or smaller scales, and vice versa. And we can start like that here. But then when we add the data, you can see that we're able to get to much larger multiples or much smaller scales, and that we improve time. But even more impressively is when we look at our polarization. So here's our EMO power factor, CMB. You can see our multiples that are above the errors are really big. When instead we look at that, you can see that we get really different small scales, and our error bars are much smaller. We're more sensitive than light for multiple. And this is really useful if you want to do things like look at sources. You can now label them and see the text.
So another data product that we have CMB instruments are CMB maps. So here is a little when we added maps data, as Simran mentioned, we have increased angular. So we can actually start resolving some point sources that were kind of was just not there before. These points are things, quasars, galaxy near the galaxies. The app actually sees a lot of point sources. So this is a projection footprint. Each blue dot is a point source, and app sees over 20,000 point sources in the database. And so this increase kind of this big field of view compared with the relatively increase in resolution can lead to transient science. So here are some papers that we listed, just transient papers. I believe that was the first one that was published in NEST, where they found 3 millimeter transients. When they weren't looking for them, they were actually looking for the hypothetical 9 in the found transients, and then got the ball rolling, and now that's a pretty big CMB experience.
Okay, but how does it work with that question to make it? Well, at a really simple level, you can see here the skeleton is showing the focal plane of the telescope. We scan the sky constantly over the same spots over many times over the time of the survey, because it's a survey telescope, and we get our we call TODs. And then you can take those TODs and you make them into the maps that we're used to see. So we break up the sky in pixels, and essentially all you're doing is linear algebra. So you can see here our equation for what the TODs look like for the CMB experiment, where we have our pixel in the sky, our pointing matrix, which is just saying where the detectors are looking, our signal, and our so essentially, you just have to do linear algebra here to be able to get the signal, and then you have to do a signal for that part. And that's how we make our maps in a very simple sense.
Right. And so to get the best possible CMB maps, we need to best possible time streams. Get the CMB maps from the time streams. So part of pre-processing the time streams or preparing them for the maps is data cuts. There are 3 different types of data cuts. First, detector cuts, where faulty detectors, so detectors that you either see in different terminals or have unusually low or high noise. Those are the time streams. We have TOD cuts, where TODs that have less than 100 detectors that pass the detector cuts are fully. Then finally, we have glitch cuts, which is what's the most relevant for our talk today. And basically, we remove unexpected spikes in the signal. We can call glitches. And to do that, we look at detectors that see a spike within 200 samples of each other and create these little things called these kind of packages of data snippets, and these are removed from the TODs, or the timestreams. So we've talked about point sources like in the maps, but what do these look like in the timestreams? Which is where we actually first see them. So imagine a point source instead. And the telescope is going to scan the sky, fixed elevation in the azimuthal direction. And so what that looks like in the time streams on the right is each time, as each detector sees the source, you will get kind of a beam-shaped spike. And stream on the left, you can see the detector see the source, and then on the right, here we have a focal plane. The affected detectors are pictured in red, and you kind of get a slide across the board, scanning the source. So this source, this like signal will be classified as will be cut as a glitch as part of pre-processing, unless the source is one of the nodes there. So if the source isn't part of our point source catalog, we see that signal is going to be automatically cut as a glitch, which necessarily won't. What do other glitches look like? Cosmic rays will hit a small section on the focal plane, and in the time streams that'll look like just a spike in a bunch of detectors at the exact same time. Electronic malfunctions can look like a bunch of different things. Example where a bunch of detectors. This can also look like a large area heat up, so just a big portion of the focal plane. And finally, we can have glitches that happen at the same time. So there's an example of a point source, and then less than 200 samples later, a cosmic ray hits the focal plane. And so that can kind of be aggregated into just one snippet. And because all these things look quite distinct, both on the focal plane and also the time streams, we can actually try to classify them into these 4 different categories.
So why is it important that we're doing this in the TOD space? So as Erika mentioned, if the sources aren't in our catalog, they can have a look maps. So here are example of single scan maps, where we have these sources that will come out of that along the scan direction because it was played and then cut out of the that's an issue if you want to look at transients. So how can we try to figure out to get these sources back in the maps instead of moving back? So as we have our 4 different glitch categories that you can see there's pretty distinct patterns in focal plane and the TODs. But we want to be able to run this in real time thanks to the Simons Observatory on site. So we need a lightweight way to do this. So what we do is we compute a set of summary statistics for each of these snippets. And then we can use those as features in a machine learning algorithm to be able to quickly identify what we think this thing is during the processing stage. So some examples of those stats are the number of peaks. Some of the peaks you have in this snippet. For something like a cosmic ray, you would have 1 peak, whereas you have a handful of peaks for something like a point source. Another example is the correlation between detectors. So, for example, cosmic ray, they're all being detected at the exact same time. You expect a very high correlation between their detectors. Whereas something like a point source, you're only going to have high correlation beside you, or you have some overlapping signal. So, as expected, you would get a block diagonal correlation. We have 3 different stats that quantify the detector layout. So, for example, how spread your detectors are in the vertical direction versus the horizontal direction, and some others. And with that, and a couple of other stats, such as number of detectors and time length, we can use those as our features. So here are the distributions for our training set for the 7 different stats. Importantly, you can see that if you looked at all the stats together for each category, they follow different patterns, which makes them good as features. We tried a few different methods, but the fastest, most lightweight, easiest one that we used that performed very well was a random forest. We decided to go with that. A random forest can be thought of like a collection of decision trees. More importantly, you can have a bunch of these different trees. You can get an average prediction as well as probabilities that these glitches are within each category. So we can ensure we're only taking high probability point sources and adding to spectrum. So how does this work? So generally for app, you have your raw data, go to TODs, you do your cuts, and you make your maps. Here's an example in standard one, with a simulated stellar flare injected into the map. And as you can see, it's been cut out. So you wouldn't actually be able to like this properly at the map base level for searches. So what we do is we modify this part. So we take our flagged glitches, compute the sum of statistics, classify them. Everything that has a probability of being a point source above 70%. We modify the cuts object, so then we're able to make our maps. Have the source still in it, so we'd be able to see it. We see it in the TODs, and we'd be able to detect the maps. So how do we perform? Here you can see a confusion matrix where it's showing the actual classification of the fit, Y, and then X is what it's predicted. So for example, that means for the top corner there, 94% of point sources that are actual point sources were predicted as a point source. So let's say you rate that. We have an overall accuracy of 90%, but importantly, 94% point sources, which is really exciting. Because those are the things we care about the most. And a lot of our decrease in accuracy is due to a lot of variability up like algorithms and vice versa. Okay, so I showed you it with the sim, but also just to quickly show you with the real thing. So here are the maps we showed you originally, and modified guidelines, we're able to actually map, which is super great. And we can also measure how these sources change over time. So the map space, you can only get down to a resolution of about 5 minutes. But TOD spaces, you can get to a much better resolution. Detectors, which Erika about.
So we tested our pipeline on the stellar flare simulations, where we injected and simulated the source into a real TOD. The TOD and it's a simulated source. We did that so we could have the realistic noise properties with that source. We know the position and the amplitude at any given moment. And those point sources, those flares, were given this flare profile where basically you get a continuous flare the first time the telescope sees the source, certain amplitude, and then that flare profile kind of decays essentially with a certain half-life. So down here, each time there's a peak that's essentially the telescope seeing the source, and you can see the source amplitude kind of decays with that flare profile. And what that looks like with in the maps. So we made simulations for 7 different half-lives and for 2 different flare amplitudes. So we didn't mention this before, but the glitch cuts happen for detectors that see a signal above a signal to noise of 10. So we chose these 2 amplitudes kind of related to that. So the TODs that we use for the simulations have noise levels of between 700 millijansky and 1 jansky. So we chose the larger amplitude, so we'd be way above that signal to noise cutoff of 10. We chose the lower amplitude so that we'd be closer to that signal to noise cutoff. So for the shorter half-lives, we do flag the source. And it is classified as a point source, but not a high probability point source. So the probability of being a point source is below 70% for both the high amplitude and the lower amplitude. For the higher amplitude, for any half-life 5 seconds and above, the point source is classified as a high probability point source, so above 70% that's a point source. So it's re-injected into the maps. And you can see that for the 5 seconds half-life, it was fully cut out originally and it's fully recovered. And then for the longer half-lives, obviously there's more scans over it, so you can still kind of see the source, but a little section is cut out and then it's kind of fills back in with the modified cuts. And then for the lower amplitude point source, the lower amplitude flare, the source is never fully cut out of the maps. However, we can always gain information from modified cuts, because at the very least, when the source is classified as one source, we can say, hey, there's something there that wasn't there before. And then for the map-based changes, we can say, maybe you should take a look at this because we just found something that was there. So to test how this would work without the signal to noise cutoff of 10, that's limited by the cuts algorithm. We tested our pipeline what we call ideal cuts, where we kind of manually flag detectors that see the source above and then it worked quite well. We covered source with high probability for all half-lives, and then that even worked for a flare that's down to 3,000 milliJSU, which is closer to the flare amplitudes that, sorry, closer to the transient amplitudes that we see in transient papers. But you can ask more about that if you. Right. So not only can this algorithm help with like finding these like flag sources and then patching them up into maps, but Simran mentioned we can gain access to higher time resolution with the TODs that we count the maps. So the maps will average observations down to about 5 minutes. Whereas with the TOD, every time we scan a word source, we can fit for its amplitude and therefore just get this higher time. Here's an example where we have a source at T0, we scan over it again 25 seconds later and 90 seconds later. These are simulations. So what we can do then is measure the amplitude every single time we see a source and then make a sub-minute to minute like curve. So here we injected sources into 11 different TODs and we recovered the light curves. Light curves are the dotted lines. The line, like square light curve is the ordered line. The main takeaway from this is that we wanted to kind of estimate the level of amplitude with which we could say this source seems to be varying. This source seems to be varying. So we calculated the significance of it when the delta as being flat line at whatever mean value is. And for half-lives shorter than 500 seconds for the higher amplitude source, we found a variable significance of 211 sigma. So basically, we could say the source is very compared to a flat line for any half-life shorter than 500 seconds.
And yeah, so we developed this using math, but we did it for the Simons Observatory. So it's built in the desert. It has a large aperture telescope, which measures the small scales. And used for things like transient science, which has optics tubes built. We have 3 small aperture telescopes, which measure the really large scales, so really used for the universe cosmology stuff. And you can also see in its footprint here, it has a large overlap with things like urban and for looking at transients and wavelengths. And in the next few years, we're thanks to SOK, we're going to have actually 6 smaller telescopes, and the lab will be fully built with optics tubes. So it's going to go from 30,000 detectors to 60,000 detectors. There's a huge number of detectors. If you remember, it's about 3,000, which is why it's really important to have these automated methods, because otherwise it results in a lot of make math, somebody looking at it, realizing something's wrong, and having to redo the whole thing. We just don't have time with the data volumes that we're going to do. So to summarize, CMB telescopes are good for transient detection due to their wide field of view and high cadence. Our algorithm now allows us to no longer cut these sources out of the maps, so identify them in the first place. And in the TOD level, before maps are even made, which allows us to make letter curves for these things and let people know if they're varying. And it's being implemented in real-time SO preprocessing pipeline, which allows the potential for rapid follow-ups. Thank you. Any questions?
Also, next trial will do something so. We have plenty of time for questions.
Thanks for the nice talk. So is there a plan to go back? Do you still have all the ACT time series? And is there a plan to go back and classify all the variable sources?
So the question was, we have all the ACT time series. Are you going to go back to try to classify them? I think that's Erika, something she's been thinking about.
Yeah, potentially. I mean, we have everything set up to do that. We still have all the TODs. We have that's pretty important. So that's something that summer students potentially do, or yeah.
Question, Chris?
Question was, do we know if there's an upper limit to, I, yeah. Well, the one thing we do know is that, studio works can look based in data. In terms of, studies of FRBs in the millimeter, or if anyone is.
Yeah, something that I would do in considering, because yeah, they do look at common phrase. One of the caveat though is they won't detector to find. Make a snippet, usually you go for, because it doesn't do that. But yeah, the proposal is similar. So I'm not sure how to do it. I just brainstormed ways to do it.
Yeah, look at it sturdy because the resolution is 20 seconds. So you just sit in one sample. So you need to look at the computer. Yeah.
Well, you know when to look, right? The radio data tells you when to look.
If we happen to do scanning stuff,
Very small, yeah.
Martin.
Yeah, I was looking at your picture. I mean, some of the other recoveries look much nicer, but this really looks like that bright source has made a blue dip around it. Is that something in act that sort of has some kind of automatic gain correction or something?
Yeah, so the question is, if you look at the source here, there's something going on in scan direction and fix that. So there's a few reasons. So one, these are what we call their maps. So they're single scan maps. It's not using all the TODs to make the maps. Because of that, we don't run it for the same number of iterations you would do science, this is for quick identification. If you run it for longer, there's a result there. And also the dipole map maker assumes a really strong-dated signal. And when you remove the right signal, it causes that.
Yeah.
Practice for identifying, but then you want to do science with it, you then go and make a much better map there. It's just would be computationally intensive to do it right.
Yeah, yeah, cool. Yeah, great.
Any other question? Yes.
Not big around forest have been checked. If much the result is dependent on hyperparameters.
Yes, so the question is for the forest, did you check how much the results depend on parameters? Yes, we did. We looked at changing the map step, which essentially is how many times can you forest split, and also changing the number of trees, those are the two main ones. And we found that the accuracy and other things you could test, like the scores, recall, and that kind of stuff, all that goes above. We get 50 trees, and I think max up to 15. The numbers are in the paper. I think those are the numbers. But yeah, the class was ground here, so we chose.
Yeah, as a follow-up question, I think like I've seen some papers that these people are discussing if these trees are being informed by all years. The results somewhat different. So have you also checked this one? Where these trees can be informed with these features or any number of these features or like some. Have you also checked that?
So the question was about the number of features and if that will change the trees. The way that we looked at that is we did something called feature accordance, where essentially you go through and it will change one of the stats a little bit, see how much it affects the accuracy, and it does that. Bunch of iterations, results, things like that. And we did that in order to determine which stat we like most. We started with a lot more stats than this. So we use that type of stuff to figure out which one should keep in because we wanted to release the number of it. And then also to make sure that we're still choosing ones that actually do affect things. So we looked at the feature accordance.
So maybe in order to understand what these hyperparameters affecting our results, maybe I can.
Sure. Yeah. Great.
Okay, great. We got a lot of good, very good questions, and I encourage you to talk to those Erika and Simran later. And let's thank those speakers again.